Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation lesson, which is evaluating research studies with various methodologies. A sensible way to determine if a study methodology is an adequate approach for your own study is to look at other people's work. Many people before you have conducted studies on similar topics, and you can learn a lot from their experiences. You're probably digging up all kinds of documents as you research a question, a problem, but you may not realize the level of analysis you go through as you scan through them. As you evaluate reports, you compare information, take notes, and form your own hypothesis. You're conducting your own surveys and tests to judge whether or not the information in each report is relevant to the problem you intend to test. Magazine racks, the library, and the web are full of surveys, case studies, experiments, and reports that can be great examples of how to set up your own study. And there are lots of sites out there on the internet to help you with the process of setting up different data collection methods. One popular site is SurveyMonkey, a site that makes building questionnaires as easy as clicking a few buttons. But as easy as the site makes to create a survey, you need to know why you're using this method of data collection. Gathering data. You have many choices in terms of methods for gathering data. You can observe, conduct interviews and surveys, test and perform experiments. These approaches to research all have their advantages and disadvantages, and it's important to know the pros and cons before you choose a methodology. Observation may seem like a simple and straightforward approach, but the data you obtain may not address the problem you want to address. How do you choose which method will work best for your study? We will examine the concepts behind different research methodologies and discuss examples from the real world that used good models for these methodologies. No matter what type of methodology you use for collecting data, you must have a clearly defined purpose. You can use the guidelines of a problem solving to establish the purpose of your test. That is, you should go into any research problem with a defined problem statement. In-depth data research versus sampling. The first question you should ask as you start to design a research project is whether or not the data you intend to collect should provide in-depth descriptive information or sampling data that offers measurable information. When you intend to study a problem in order to understand behaviors or attitudes, that problem becomes a candidate for in-depth research. Case studies, interviews, and observations fall under this category. When you are looking to generate numbers and statistics that can serve as evidence for a problem, you would use the approach of sampling. Surveys, experiments offer the opportunity to work with samples of population to gather data. Case studies as a methodology. In a case study, you want to understand what happened to a person or in a situation. In these studies, you seek to understand why behavior occurred over time. The data that you gather will ultimately tell a story about a person, program, place, or event. You might select a specific case to illustrate how a person was effective at solving a problem, or you can use case studies as examples of how programs do not work. Often these stories provide a context for other studies, helping to explain the numbers that occur in surveys and experiments. The case study is an appropriate strategy for research when you want to offer a high level of detail about the data, but you won't be able to generalize your detailed data to other or larger issues. Ask the following questions to determine whether or not the problem you want to examine is a candidate for a case study. Do you want to explore the causes of an event or in a behavior? Do you want to explain complex links between situations? Do you want to provide real-world context to better illustrate the problem? Do you want to describe the full details of the problem? To conduct an effective case study, you must be able to develop a plan that clearly identifies the case and the relevant problem you're studying. The study you produce should be a thorough and comprehensive account. So before you begin, you need to have a firm grasp on the issues involved. Therefore, the early stages of the study, you must gather as much background documents as possible. If you plan to interview people involved with the case, you should be able to ask good questions and know how to interpret different responses. Your purpose with a case study is to learn about an issue and to describe it in precise detail by evaluating data and creating a report. For a basic case study, you could apply the following steps. 1. Establish your research question. 2. Create the structure for your case study. 3. Determine your interview or research questions. 4. Collect data over weeks and months. And 5. Analyze data and produce a narrative report. The Natural Resources Defense Council, or the NRDC, conducted a case study that outlines the process for the Dry Turgis Ecological Reserve in the Gulf of Mexico and how it came to be. This brief study was outlined with the NRDC website, which outlines the story of how the reserve came to be, the risks it faces, its goals, and results. You can take a look at this at http://www.nrdc.org. This is an example of more of a research and observational type of case study. For case studies that involve personal interviews, look at some articles from Psychology Today. There you can have some great example of personal interview research. Surveys as a methodology. We use surveys to gather data about groups of people so we can learn about their benefits, beliefs, behavior, and knowledge. The form of data gathering is a descriptive method rather than an experimental method that we use when we want to learn about phenomena that we cannot directly observe. Researchers tend to use surveys to evaluate changes in a group and understand and measure attitudes and preferences. Two common surveys used in research protocols are cross-sectional surveys and longitudinal surveys. Cross-sectional surveys target specific groups of people to determine attitudes and behavior at a specific time. For example, a common cross-sectional survey examined how 2 voters feel about the president this week. Longitudinal surveys also target specific groups, but involve long-term studies that reflect changes in attitudes or behaviors over time. A longitudinal survey might examine how voters feel about the president each year from 2008 to 2012. Surveys can be conducted face-to-face, on the phone, on paper, or through electronic means such as the web. Each of these methods has benefits and drawbacks. Face-to-face interviews get you the highest response rate of any type of survey. You can also do surveys by phone, but those are not as effective, and web surveys or pencil and paper surveys usually get the lowest response of all unless you do some extra nudging. People may rush through a web survey more than a paper survey, and that may mean you don't get as much data as you normally would, or that some of the data may be inaccurate. However, people are often more willing to be honest on web and paper surveys because of confidentiality, as opposed to face-to-face surveys. The United States Census is an example of research conducted as a survey which generates measurable data that can be reported. In the report for housing characteristics, you can see the question posted on the survey to gather specific data. The Census Bureau formulated questions as follows. In this house, apartment, or mobile home, is it A, owned by you or someone in this household with a mortgage or loan? B, owned by you or someone in this household free and clear? C, rented? Or D, occupied without payment of rent? By asking that one question around, the Census Bureau was able to gather data that reflected which states had the most homers and which had the most rentals, and what region of the country the most homeowners lived. Experiments as methodology. We often think of experiments as tests that are conducted in a laboratory environment, but people conduct experiments in all kinds of environments. Experiments are tests, and in their most common form, we conduct experiments to gather data that we can measure. Professional research perform controlled experiments, which is an experiment to test a hypothesis by changing certain conditions against control measures. You're looking for cause and effect when you set up the experiment. You want to understand what caused any changes you may have observed. To do this study, what happens when you change one variable or element in a test? You change only one variable at a time for each experiment so that you can isolate and determine whether that change caused the effects we observe. There are three types of variables in an experiment. 1. The experiment variable is the condition you are studying in the experiment to see whether changes in one factor will produce notable results. 2. The control variables are items that do not change throughout the experiment. These elements stay the same throughout the experiment. You want as many controls as possible to measure against the experimental variable. And 3. The responsive variable is the element that we study to see if the experiment has any effect. You start an experiment with the control setup, which is the base measurement of the experiment. After you set up the control, you perform the experimental setup, which is exactly the same as the control, except we introduce the experimental variable. You then run the control and the experiment together to see if changing one element will change the outcome of the study. Reliability, external validity, and internal validity. As we perform experiments, we need to consider whether or not we have designed our experiments to meet the rigorous standards of the scientific method. An experiment must be reliable so that you can perform it more than once and get the same results again. And it must be valid, meaning that you can provide proof for the results that you have measured and studied. Along with general validity, you must also consider external and internal validity, which are factors that help you establish that you have assembled an authentic study. The external validity of the study is determined by the size of the sample, whether you have gathered a large enough group from which to collect data. If your data is based on a sample that's too small, you cannot make generalizations about the results because your sample size could be relevant only to a few subjects. For data from a sample to have internal validity, you need to show evidence that you designed the study with adequate control over the process of the gathering data. Control is very important to internal validity and research in general. That is, you need to make sure that when you test a theory in a study, you change only one aspect of the study at a time. To evaluate whether or not the study has internal validity, you must identify the change you make with only possible causes of results you observe and measure. You set up the experiment to remove all outside influences, or as many as possible, and this allows you to see changes more clearly. But remember that just because you've done everything right and controlled the study correctly doesn't mean that you will see any meaningful changes. The list below outlines factors that may impact internal validity when you conduct experiments that involve people as subjects, such as psychology. 1. The history and evidence outside the test. 2. Maturation, which is subjects changed during the tests. Are they of the same maturity level? 3. When you lose participants. 4. When you choose the wrong equipment. 5. When you select participants or groups based on convenience. And 6. The Hawthorne effect. When people know they're in an experiment, their behavior may change. You may have a study with internal validity, but because you don't have a big enough sample size, you cannot generalize the information, and therefore the study has no external validity. That doesn't mean the results are not valid at all. It just means the results are valid only in the scenario that you studied. For example, what you know about the studies in your own school can't be generalized to students in another country, such as Mexico. In conclusion, there are many different approaches to research which have advantages and disadvantages that you need to be familiar with as you choose a methodology for gathering data. As you start to design a research study, you should first ask whether your report needs to provide information that is in-depth and descriptive, or whether you should be looking at a large sample of data that can be measured. Case studies give you the opportunity to understand what happened to a person or situation. In these studies, you seek to understand why behavior occurred over time. The data that you gather will ultimately tell a story. We use surveys to collect a lot of data in order to find our beliefs, behaviors, and knowledge. Depending on how a survey is set up, you can end up with descriptive results or results that you can measure. Finally, when you set up an experiment, you're testing a theory and looking for cause and effect. The data you gather through experiments can help you understand what caused changes that you may have observed. So, thank you very much for your time. This concludes our presentation.